welcome from that cuckold in the Northeast, the land of colonialism and historical reverence, delving into free and intrepid esoteric exploration, everything under the aforementioned umbrella. I welcome you on a journey into the most detailed accounts of experience, evidence, and anecdote. I am your host, Michael Roser, and this evening on Dark Hour Paranormal, we're going to stick with the current layout here. We have been delving into the field of ufology, obviously, for quite some time here since 2017, explicitly, when a lot of this information began to arise in the mainstream media. It has captured the imagination and interest of many different groups of people, and I'll be honest with you, some of these very public and extroverted in that respect, and believe me, this is a topic that is not going away. There is too much in way of implication. Now, recently we had Philip Mantle on the show to share his book, UFO Landings UK. It was a fantastic read. Very much enjoyed his time here. Another fantastic researcher in this world of ufology specifically. Now, tonight, my guest is Charles Lear, who is also an author and has been working within this field for many years and has garnered plenty of research. And we'll talk about that research and perhaps something in way of his own experiences moving forward. But he does have a new book that just, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was released on June 1st, yesterday. And I want to congratulate Charles on this release. And the book is called The Flying Saucer Investigators. And this is why I've titled the show this way tonight, because I'd like to dive deep into what Charles has put together in way of comprehension. From what I understand, looking over his literature with this specific piece, this is another account of many historical sightings that go back X number of years. And of course, these are very relevant to use in comparison to what we're experiencing today and finding that parallel that may or may not be interwoven between the two topics. Now, The Flying Saucer Investigators is a book of history. It's about the people involved in the mystery of the flying saucers, mostly the investigators, but also the witnesses, some of whom were profoundly affected. The period, yes, you guessed it, 1947, after the sighting that year by businessman pilot Kenneth Arnold, and ends in 1969 with the termination of the U.S. Air Force's investigation, which existed for most of its duration as Project Blue Book. You guys know what Project Blue Book is for sure. The investigators ran seriously to take flying saucer reports and follow up on them, and the U.S. Congress was moved to hear arguments for a federally funded study of flying saucers on 2 occasions. Very, very interesting to revisit this, folks, and then look at it in its entirety in way of what we're working with today, our UAP task force, and many of these other peripheral groups that are out there doing this work at large. The history in this golden age is presented using newsletters, magazines, case files, official documents, newspaper articles, film footage, and archived recordings from television and radio. Some of the cases are the case the investigator looked into may be left wondering by many of them. Now, that is about Charles' new book that was released yesterday. Let me just give you a quick editorial here on Charles himself. Charles Lear has had many interests. Of course, UFOs take up more than a little of his time. His main interest in the UFO subject are in the documented history and the phenomenon that is spawned and the people who investigate it, as this book reflects. Charles' other interests are geology, cool, paleontology, and his familiarity with science and its disciplines they uniform his approach to the UFO subject. Now, again, this is very important to have that analytical side, that critical thinking when looking through this. And yes, we end up sounding like a broken record sometimes, but listen, this is what we're working with. These are the parameters, the tools that we have in front of us to really decipher what it is that we may be seeing. Now, having lived most of his life in New York City, where he made his living as a union stagehand and was involved in other aspects of theater as a playwright, producer, director, and Shakespearean actor, Charles now resides in New York. Well, we're not too far from New York here in Massachusetts, but as we'd like to say here on the show and, of course, on YouTube, without further ado, I would like to personally introduce to you Charles Lear. Charles, how you
Hello.
doing tonight, man? Thanks so much for being here with us.
Oh, my pleasure. Welcome, nice to see you, Massachusetts.
Cheerio, mate. That you've compiled. And just before I do that, I'd like to know a little bit about how you decided that this was a path that you wanted to take, some sort of trajectory, okay, that brought you into the field, and when you decided to become something more public in way of your creation, obviously doing the articles, perhaps doing other presentations. Where did this all begin for you in way of certain interest?
Well, I've always been interested in it. I'm interested in pretty much everything, as you can tell by paleontology and geology being included in that. But ultimately, that's history. Uh, so I I really became a producer as opposed to a consumer of
Mm-hmm.
ufological related materials. I watched a hell of a
Mm-hmm.
lot of documentaries, and I love to take naps to UFO documentaries. It's like watching baseball. It's like you can take a nap and then get up, and then something interesting happens. But I became a producer when I started writing for Martin Willis at Podcast UFO. And that came about because he used to give you an hour, and then if you wanted the other hour, you needed to give him a little donation via PayPal. I didn't want to get a PayPal
Mm-hmm.
account, so I offered to block for him in order to get the other hour. He he had a spot he called a guest blogger. So he said, sure. So I started blogging for him, and I turned one in every week. And I've been doing that for 4 years. And along the lines, basically, I found my voice, I found my approach, and that's history. That's what I love. And basically, writing for Martin Willis at Podcast UFO is really how I got into this.
Now, I'm listening to your background here, and of course, the question presses up against me quite uh, discernibly here, and that is, are you more on the research and academic end of things, or do you consider yourself an experiencer as well, whether it be just seeing something up in the sky that you can't necessarily define, or actually been in contact with these particular extraterrestrials that may or may not be abducting people? Do you have anything in way of, again, that type of experience?
I don't have any UFO experiences. I've had psychic experiences, which you
Mm,
can take with a grain of salt because it's all anecdotal. But
hmm.
I had it's basically in the form of dreams. I dreamt a coworker had a heart attack, and the next day he did. This is a big one. I dreamt about 9/11 before it happened. Basically,
Oh, wow.
I was working down at the waterfront. Um, uh, in a scenic shop uh, uh, in the Brooklyn waterfront, and you could see the Twin Towers from there. The first plane had hit. We were all out for coffee break. The second plane flew in.
Mm,
Well, my dream, we when it flew in, the underside of it, it was to the underside was facing us, and my first thought was that it was a firefighting
hmm.
plane going to pour water on the fire. Um, And the dream I had the night before was that a plane flew into the World Trade Center, and the actual impact was obscured by a building. And I was disappointed that I couldn't see the impact, and I felt guilty that I couldn't see that I felt that way. Which,
Huh.
and that
Well,
happened the very next day, and those same feelings. Um, And
w-
like I say, it's anecdotal and very after the fact. You can take that for what it is, but that's what happened to me. I also used to work in an office in my grandfather's lab. Um, and there was an old timey style radio uh, on my desk.
Yes.
And I, in the dream, I heard news that sent a bolt of adrenaline through me. That was all apocalyptic based, Third World War thing. This was in the 80s or very early 80s, probably about, might have been 82. Well, actually, there is a definite date because
Mm-hmm.
it was the very night before the Russians shot down 007, a passenger plane that went into their airspace.
Mm-hmm.
And that anybody who didn't live back then, it was tense. Um, and that's when the day after came, the movie The Day After came after that. We thought it was really we were gonna blow each other up. So yeah, there was that, and that
Well,
happened. So the same desk, same radio, same bolt of adrenaline. But
so you're
it's
bringing
you
up
know that
something I find very. I'm sorry. I just want to say something very quickly. You're bringing up something that I find very interesting because there are many people who believe there may be a correlation, very starkly and observable, between understanding this UFO phenomenon at large and psychic activity, clairvoyance. I mean, God, you've got Dr. Steve.
all right. I'm sorry, I can't hear you at all right now. Hi. Well, I'm all alone right now. I heard you mention Stephen Greer. A lot of people think that Stephen. There you are.
I do
Hi there.
apologize. This is really not the case. I mean, we'll have a couple drops here and there, but this is a little bit over the top. I do apologize. Were you able to catch the question I was asking prior to that
No, I
drop?
didn't. No, I didn't. I heard as far as you mentioning Stephen
Okay.
Greer.
Okay. Occasionally I may stop the camera just to get it more fluid. But anyway, yes. So we have Stephen Greer over here with a CE5. It's essentially transcendental meditation of sort. This is derived and reflected in other practices that deal with this. So my question to you is within this clairvoyance and especially the dreams, okay? Because that's actually a whole other subject I would love to touch on and dive deep with you at another point, because tonight we're going to be talking about your book. But have you ever found any sort of correlation between extraterrestrials and these dream states, or any of the clairvoyance that you may have experienced? Have you seen any of that connection that people report?
Uh, I can't say that I've seen it. I know that a lot of people approach
Hmm.
it from that direction, and historically, from the very beginning, there was the Borderlands Sciences Research Association, started by Mead Lane,
Hmm.
and also Mark Probert. Mark Probert claimed to get information clairaudiently. They
Hmm.
investigated the very first uh, a UFO sighting. Okay, not the very first, but a UFO sighting in 1946. And
Hmm.
Mark Probert spoke with the creators of this beast. Basically, it was a sort of an airship with flapping wings, and he was told it's called a Carita. So you can still find that they put out a magazine called Round Robin, and you can still find Round Robin on the Borderland Sciences Research Foundation website. It's probably .org. And you can find the article discussing this. So they approached it from a very esoteric standpoint. The Swedes also approached the subject esoterically. Um, UFO Sweden, actually the
Mm-hmm.
uh, archives uh, for unexplained phenomena. I believe that's what it's called. Um,
Mm-hmm.
they Klaus Svan actually writes extensively about the esoteric approach to ufology. So it's got a long history. I personally like dealing with it as an historian uh, because it's factual. You can't deny that this person reported this to the police, to the Air Force, which is, pretty impressive. There are reports written down
Yes.
by the police,
Credible
by
sources.
the Air
Yeah.
Force, yes, and also the UFO investigators as well. And so there is all this amazing documentation out there. So what I did in the book was just, this is the report, this is the documentation. I footnoted everything. My practice in writing for Martin is to link
Mm-hmm.
so that the reader, I go for the original sources as much as possible. I'm not a guy who's going to say some people said,
Do you find
or I'm sorry, go ahead.
do you no, I was just going to ask you, do you find a lot of challenge in procuring some of those original sources these days, especially considering that many of these events happened so many years ago?
Not at all. It's amazing what's available on the web.
Mm.
You've got AFU. But if you type in files.afu.se, that's AFU Sweden, uh, they've got uh, all the APRO bulletins. Uh, they've got an astounding amount of material, which I used as a source for a lot of things in this book. NICAP there's still a website for NICAP, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial
Yeah.
Phenomena. For those of you who don't know, Donald Kehoe was the director for most of its uh, life. And NICAP.org. You can find case files there. QFOS.org, the Center for UFO Studies. JLN Hynek started that,
Yes.
making the invisible college visible. And QFOS.org still has a site. QFOS still has a site, even though they don't exist. The files are there, and all this stuff is wonderful. I've also David Marler. He's actually I made friend Martin introduced me to him when I was out in New Mexico. Actually, the way the uh, my bio on the back cover originally used to say Charles now resides in New Mexico. That's why that seems a little awkward. It was a little too late to change it in order to get the book published on time. So I was living in New
Understood.
Mexico. I'm in Queens now, so you can imagine why I left Queens to go to New Mexico in 2020. So Martin
Mm-hmm.
introduced me to David
A little
Marler,
different.
and David Marler. I don't know if you know, he wrote a book, Triangular UFOs: Estimate of the Situation, and he has all the QFOS archives, the physical archives. He has all the NICAP
Mm-hmm.
archives, the physical archives. They gave them to him. Uh, and he's also got original Project Blue Book files. He's got an amazing amount of material. He was also an editor for the UFO news clipping service. Um, he took over from oh, the name escapes me, but he did that
Mm-hmm.
for a while, and that's also the UFO news clipping service goes from, I think, the late 60s up until 2011. So you've got newspaper articles like compiled, it's a news clipping service, and AFU, Archives for the Unexplained. That's it. They the same thing, files.afu.se. You can find the UFO news clipping service there. So, and also there's archives.org. It's astounding how much material there is out there that you can just, type your keyboard
Well,
and find.
we know that there are individuals out in the field, such as Philip Mantle, as we've obviously talked about him here on the show and showcase his book. You have Michael Schratt, you have Preston Dennett, you have even Jim Goodall. I mean, some of these prominent figures that have gone way out of their way to preserve some of these physical documentations that we can now sit down and look through in respect to an actual archive. Yes, having the internet at our fingertips, it makes it much more accessible, okay, to perhaps call up some of these events and have them in one compartmentalized location. But yes, there are many places that we can still go to refer to what was happening. And again, you mentioned lots of corroboration in respect to the evidence, and that is also true. And of course, when you really start getting into this, Charles, you have to sit back and say, intellectually, I'm going to deduce that there is absolutely something at bay. Okay, regardless of what people would like to say in way of misinformation, disinformation, just taking a skew 90-degree turn and just flipping the tunnel. It's very evident that we're looking into this. And of course, today we have this in the mainstream media. We have the congressional hearings that happened perhaps 2 weeks ago. It's becoming a worldwide interest and is gaining traction around the dinner table and in common households. So hopefully, we are planting some of these seeds by allowing folks to have access to something as comprehensive as the book you have just created, that again archives all of these different things that you would like to explore. Now, I have a very specific question for you, okay? And this is something that I became aware of back in the 90s. And I think it was specifically from a man named Drunvalo Melchizedek, who is essentially a walk-in, he's got geometry behind his belt in way of sacred works. He's explored the pyramids, blah, blah, blah. The guy has a whole bunch of things under his belt in way of repertoire, the Merkaba meditation. He had mentioned in one of his books that he'd written that there were several countries, I believe it was in the early to mid 1990s, that had actually told outright their populations that, yes, there are extraterrestrials. They may come down and land in our country. Nope, there's nothing we can do about it. You leave them alone, then they'll leave you alone. Are you aware of this? And I'm asking this too because I know Mexico was definitely on the list. I want to say that it might have been Greenland or Finland came in. Germany, I think, was also one. Have you heard anything about this particular thought, really?
No, I haven't heard that at all. That's interesting. Um, yeah, that name is very
It's
complex. So
something,
if you could
yeah.
email it to me, I'd love that. I'd like to look into that further.
Oh, yeah. I'd be more than happy to. I don't know why I haven't been asking people this question, because it's always been there in the back of my mind. But talking about different countries, Philip is over in the UK. He's shared, many different sightings that happened throughout history there. I believe that you have some relevance with Canada, right, in the way of their history. Is that correct?
Oh, I mentioned.
Do you have a background in that?
I mentioned the two big Canada cases in the book that because they came up during the Condon Committee's investigation, the University of Colorado, funded by the Air Force. So that was the Shag Harbor incident and the Falcon Lake incident.
Yes.
Okay, so Falcon Lake was a guy basically saw a craft. It took off and he got burned on his stomach, had a grid mark of little dots on his belly. Stephen McCallick. And Shag Harbor incident, crash in the water, orange foam RMC, large number of official organizations got involved in that one. So yeah, I have those two Canadian episodes in the book. But also, I'm really there are a lot of really cool Canadian cases, and NOFORS, the North Ontario UFO Research Society, I believe. He's got a great website and great archives. You can get flying saucer reviews there. So yeah, but what's really interesting is I've just recently, like the last couple of days, come to this observation that not only from country to country do uh, sightings have their own flavor, sort of according to the
Yeah.
culture, but from state to state. Like, for instance, Ohio
Huh.
seems to have a lot of police UFO chases, the most famous being Dale Spar. And New Mexico crashes. And
Mm-hmm.
you go from state to state. They all seem to, West Virginia, okay, has creatures associated with UFOs.
Oh yeah.
You've got Pennsylvania, Chestnut Ridge, Bigfoot and UFOs together. I mean, it's interesting that it changes from state to state. There is an actual culture from state to state about UFOs or UFOs. Actually, I prefer that. I've recently come to
That's
that.
incredible. I mean, and, yeah.
Oh, I'm
Well,
sorry.
that's interesting that it actually transposes from state to state. Now, country to country, I understand. There's usually a culture that goes within that, but then if you look in the states, there could be something considered to be subcultures that, again, maybe encapsulating some of this, and obviously the sightings and the way they're reported, uh, of information that they have behind them in order to do that, or the lack thereof, it always yields a different type of result. One of the things I've noticed is that these governments deal with sightings differently. Okay, not necessarily
Yeah.
in the most superficial senses. All of them will try to hide this, kind of stow it away, and hush the whole thing up. We can say that that's a common motif with governments and sightings. But have you seen any differences? Very starkly in the way that certain governments are handling these type of sightings within history, and have you seen any of them open up outside of the United States in such a way that we could say maybe there's something in way of a twinge of disclosure,
Well,
formal disclosure, let me put it that way.
South America had official UFO investigations, and they were very open. I believe Brazil. Brazil. I don't know if you're familiar with the Claris incidents. UFOs were. They called them chupa chupas down there because they said they were taking blood from people. People would have a couple of marks.
Mm-hmm.
And people, they're very violent in Brazil. There are a lot of violent UFO encounters in Brazil, but the government investigated it,
Yes.
and opened up the files. So there have been a few official government investigations that were transparent in South America. France is a great example. GEPAN in France, they released a report. You can buy it. Especially during the triangular UFO sightings they had there. So there. What's interesting. So yeah, there are countries where it's open. It. What I've found in my research, mainly for the book, is that it depends on who's in charge. The Air Force investigation, depending on who was in charge, they're either open to it or they're going to debunk it. And that pretty much goes for everybody around the world. People are people.
Mm-hmm.
There are believers and non-believers. And it depends on who's in charge as to, how they approach the subject. So That's the long answer to your question, I
and
guess.
how much is disseminated in way of that information? Yeah,
Uh, l-
absolutely. You know, you talk about. Sorry, go ahead.
Actually, what's funny is what I found is the most closed mouth are the British. They release the MOD files, but they're like, "Eh." uh, they're very closed.
Hmm.
Uh, they put the clamps down in Australia as well with the Westall sightings. They just
Yes.
stomped on that. So the British government is, you know, I think they're the uh, historically they've been the most closed, but there's a really strong British UFO research, private research. There are a lot of private researchers in Britain, and they have a
Hmm.
history about as long as the United States in terms of private investigators. Um, and
I can only imagine.
that's yeah, that's a wonderful history in itself. I'd like to write a book about that, but I got to write part two of this thing. So, mm.
Now, when you sat down and said, "I want to compile this information," and you started having the vision of a book for you in the near future, what was the process that you went through to garner some of this? I mean, you mentioned your sources, but how did you decide to literally, in an architectural fashion, put this book together? And initially, what was your goal for this book overall? What did you want to convey to the public with this specifically?
Great question. And by the way, all your questions have been really good. Um,
Thank you.
what happened is Martin Willis said, Charles, you've been writing blogs for me ever, or you've written a lot of blogs for me. It's been about 4 years. So I put them out about once a week. So that's about 200 blogs. He said, you should put out a book. And I said, I was really interested in the investigators themselves, as I'm a big fan of the Mothman prophecies, just because it's such a weird book. I had an idea that I
John
wanted to
Keel.
do. Absolutely, I had an idea that I wanted to write a television series. uh, with John Keel as the protagonist. So I started reading I have read the Mothman prophecies over and over before that, but I started reading it from beginning to end, beginning to end. And when I was done, I'd just start over again. And I did this repeatedly. Uh, and trying to figure out what the hell is so weird about this book. And what I realized is it's about six books in one. I actually write about that in the book too. Uh,
Huh.
and yeah, he actually got the Eighth Tower as well out of that book. His editors just went, you got to cut this down. I think it was more than twice as long as it is now. And basically, what's
Oh,
going on
wow.
in that book is he's got his contactee he was open to contactees, which made him very different from a lot of people back then. So he has contactees in Long Island. He's got Men in Black. He's got um, UFOs. He's got the Mothman. He's got other creatures. And so that's what I realized, that this book is incredibly dense, and it's not all about the Mothman. The Mothman is kind of like here, and then there's all this other stuff. But along the way, he talks about these characters, Gray Barker, Ivan Sanderson, and Jim Mosley.
Hmm.
And they seemed really interesting to me, especially Gray Barker and Jim Mosley, when they're messing with him on the phone during his investigations at the height of his paranoia. And, he, I said, I got to find out who these guys are. And so I started looking into them. And that's when I got the idea, looking at it just from the perspective of researching the investigators, uh, is something I want to do. So uh, Martin introduced me to Philip Mantle, who runs Flying Disc Press. And I pitched the idea to him, and he
Mm-hmm.
said, "Yeah, do it." So that's what I did.
Part two. Not to take away any focus from what you've just released, and I was right about when this dropped. It was yesterday, correct?
Correct. Yes. Oh, and also you asked me
Yes.
about the process. Uh,
Yes. Yes.
yeah, the process was I laid it out chronologically. So I had the basic thesis, um, which is I'm going to cover this from 1947 Kenneth Arnold sighting, June 24th, 1947, uh, and the closing of Project Blue Book in 1969. So I've already got it's chronological. So that's a really easy approach. Uh, so I realized the first thing I got to look into is the Shaver mystery and Ray Palmer. Now, Ray Palmer,
Mm-hmm.
John Keel called him the man who invented UFOs. So I got to look into this guy. So I bought a book, Richard Toronto, The Man from Mars. And that talks about Ray Palmer. It also gets into his relationship with Richard Shaver. Richard Shaver basically had the Taros and the Daros. That's an incredibly complex subject that I really don't want to get into right now. But it's called the Shaver mystery.
Mm-hmm.
That there are
Mm-hmm.
beings living within the earth that control our minds with radio waves. Shaver was most likely, according to Ray Palmer, he was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, and believing somebody's controlling your mind with rays is a symptom.
Well, hold on. Let me
Uh,
throw something at you real quick
oh,
in
great,
line
go
with
for it.
that.
Sure.
Let me throw you something real quick. Okay, so whether you're a believer or not in you know congressional hearings on project of this magnitude where they were playing with people's minds in way of manipulation and control. Now, through the Montauk Project, again, I can sit here and say alleged, but you guys know my affiliation. They basically dialed down the exact frequencies, the set of frequencies that will influence a human being's mind and other life forms, and that was 420 megahertz, and I think goes up to about 460 megahertz. So within that range, they defined where it was. So for maybe in this gentleman's case, he might have had some mental instability. There was something else at play, but I think the concept itself that there are ways to influence people's thoughts in the way that they behave, how you put thoughts into somebody's head, can be done through the understanding of frequency specifically. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I do believe that this is a possibility, and even in way of subliminal messaging, which we saw, quite prevalently through, I think, the 50s, 60s, 70s, a little bit of the 80s, on television and so forth, flashing the momentary image just to have the subconscious catch it. It's very possible that there might be something along that, but I did want to mention that to you very quickly as we were talking about this.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll tell you,
You could disagree.
no. I'm trying to. I'm a little obsessive. Okay, now it's straight. Anyway, I like to keep an open mind. Uh, I don't like to sit on just one perspective, one way of looking at things. I guess it's kind of a Zen Buddhist
Mhm.
approach. And
It's also smart.
you know, I'll look at something like that as a thought experiment. And if I'm interested enough, I'll research it and
Mhm.
see what kind of documentation there is to back that up. But anyway, so uh, the I'm already set up chronologically. Um, so as I'm going through it, different characters start popping into the story. And they're the characters I'm interested in, but they're all the flying saucer researchers. Um, and so as the characters pop in, I try to get to uh, the best sources I can get to
Mhm.
talk about them
Mhm.
and not to speculate. So, I don't want to put words into any of the characters' mouths. I want to tell their story as accurately as possible with sources cited. Yeah, basically, since it was already set up chronologically, and I'm looking at material chronologically, especially the APRO bulletin, which was put out by the Aerial Phenomena Research Association,
Hmm.
started by Jim and Coral Lorenzen, I believe in 1954. That goes from I think 1954 up until 1988. The UFO Investigator, put out by the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena.
Yes.
That starts in around 1956, maybe 57, because Keogh took over, I think, around then. But anyway, it goes up until NICAP's demise. They kind of had a long, slow death after 1969. But in any case, I'll say up to 1969, the UFO investigators there. Um, so those and Jim Moseley, who uh, put out Nexus, Saucer News, Saucer Gnews, Saucer Smear. He ended with Saucer Smear in 2012, right around his death. So I've got all these chronological newsletters, and then people. It was mainly in there that the characters would start popping up. For instance, I'll shorten this, but one good example is I'm thinking to myself, wow, I really got to talk about James McDonald. How the hell am I going to get James McDonald in here? Lo and behold,
Hmm.
James McDonald shows up in the UFO Investigator and the APRO Bulletin. New guy on the scene, a scientist is standing forward, and there's actually a funny back and forth between APRO and NICAP because James McDonald actually was a NICAP member. It's not very well
Interesting.
publicized anywhere.
I didn't know that.
Um, yeah, I actually had to get a personal communication to like nail that down. APRO claimed it in the APRO bulletin, but yeah, and then in any case, so there I'm able to write about James McDonald, and the source for that is Anne Druffel's book Firestorm, which is amazing. I mean, just in terms
Hmm.
of its information, um, she had access through his family, and actually had access to his notebooks. That he kept in his pocket and wrote his little notes down. And she read it, so she would, say, day by day, this is what this guy's thinking. So it's an amazing uh, document of what James McDonald went through. Another example, Leonard Stringfield.
Hmm.
I was like, another guy. I got to write about Leonard Stringfield. And for those who don't know, Leonard Stringfield was really big into UFO crashes. One of the first, and before the whole Roswell thing even happened, uh, he actually had a phone line directly to the Air Force. The ground observer corps would see something, he'd get it, and he'd investigate it. Basically, he had a direct line to the Air Force for about a year. Foxtrot Kilo, I think 123, I think is the name of a book he wrote. You can actually get that free, I think, on the NICAP website. But in any case, I got to talk about Leonard Stringfield. Well, I'm researching the Kelly Hopkinsville incident because it was investigated by Isabel Davis, who worked with civilian science. Civilian saucer investigators in New York.
Hmm.
So she went down to Kentucky in 1955 and actually, did a wonderful investigation. And they put out an amazing publication for CUFOS. And the publication covers the Kelly Hopkinsville case, and it also has a guy named Ted Blocher, or maybe Blocher, Bloecher, um, and he investigated humanoids with Leonard Stringfield. So there I've got Leonard Stringfield. So I can talk about Leonard Stringfield. So that's basically how everything came into place in this book. By going chronologically and researching, the characters would just come up.
Well, within your research here, there's all question that comes up when we talk about these unidentified crafts in the sky, whatever the vessel may be. We're wondering two things specifically. One, where did it come from? What is it, right? What is this craft and the material that's there? What is the meta propulsion that it may be encapsulating? Because we don't see any way of familiar conventional propulsion. And two, who the hell's driving this thing? All right. Now there have been many speculations, right? And we can stay academic about this, and we don't necessarily have to go into the evidence, but we can say for sure.
Just so to be straight, I've never been to college, so I'm not an academic by any means.
No, that's all right. But your research is there. Go ahead.
Yeah, to address your question, actually, that's John Keel never went to college either. So we're known as autodidacts. We teach
Interesting.
ourselves. Yes.
I didn't know there was a word for that.
Yeah, autodidact.
I like it.
Yeah, wear it proudly. Anyway, what's really funny about your question is, who's driving these things? Donald Kehoe at NICAP would have nothing to do with humanoid reports because they were too close to contactee reports for him. APRO embraced contactee reports. So, depending on the researcher, Kehoe thought that it made the subject less credible, whereas APRO was like, you got to know who's driving these things. But it's been 75 years. We see a lot of patterns, but the patterns change constantly. And it's still a mystery. There are wonderful theories, speculations out there. I've got a really fun one if you'd like to hear it.
Yes, I would. Absolutely. Please share away.
All right. Imagine that this is what's going on our planet is a common trajectory. We're on the verge of developing AI. We have developed AI essentially. People follow their GPSs blindly into, I've done it, into roads that go nowhere. So if AI is so prevalent that people no longer have to think, there's no longer selection for intelligence. So with that off the table, you can have de-evolution. Devo. But anyway, de-evolution.
Yeah.
So imagine a planet where this has happened. You've got, yet they have achieved an amazing amount of technology. Like they've opened up wormholes. They've created craft that can whisk you away to another planet in, moments. And you've got all these degenerate creatures wandering the planet whose every needs are taken care of. So imagine, these creatures walk into a Stargate or a craft that whisks them away and they end up on this planet. So that, maybe that explains Bigfoot. Maybe that explains the fact that a lot of reports, the creatures just seem really confused and, so, that's a fun speculation.
Well, if the idea is that, it certainly has been proposed by many different people in many different ways that, all right, first I'll start by saying this. I think the percentage, just making a quick stab at this in way of estimate, we're looking at maybe 80%, maybe 90% of what we see in our skies as back-engineered reconnaissance material that we have figured out how to operate. Yes, it could be very well alien technology or coming from some other place other than our terrestrial plane. But the fact is we have it. Now, the other 10% they have speculated is when you actually see a craft or a group of beings in the sky that something happened in way of the cloaking device that they use, so that there's a malfunctioning there. Of course, there is still a very mechanical aspect to some of these crafts, although people do call them organic too. So that's something to explore, I think. But
Yeah.
again, we go back and we
sorry.
look. Yep. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, I'm on the esoteric side. Okay, have you seen Ellen Stevelman's, I believe his name is, Witness of Another World? This
I
was
don't think I have.
this was a kid in I believe it was Ecuador, who was his family. He's basically a gaucho. Um, he was sent out to check on some cattle, so he's on his horse, and craft lands. He's brought into the craft, meets a creature, and then leaves the craft. His horse is injured, and he's worried about his horse. But he goes back and he tells this story that this craft landed. I had this encounter with this being in the craft, and he's on the news. It makes the news, but when he's at the press conference, he breaks down. This kid goes into hiding because he's afraid of, people are ridiculing him. So he basically ends up completely isolated. This Alan Stevelman went and found him, interviewed him. Jacques Vallée actually investigated the case at the time. Found him, this poor isolated older man. He hooked him up with the witness. I believe his name is Juan, I believe. But the witness, his ancestry was indigenous peoples. And they had a tradition that you would see these, they basically had a tradition that this was an experience. This kind of experience was something that was meant to move you forward spiritually. Essentially, he went through a ritual to get a name.
Okay.
And he was given the name, and his life made sense after that. So this experience put into that context made sense to him and fixed them all up. So it's I that's a way of looking at this phenomenon, as maybe it's the gods talking to us saying, you know what, even with all your technology, you still haven't killed us. So that's another way of looking at it, as opposed to the nuts and bolts thing, or government craft, reverse engineered alien technology. Maybe it's John Keel was really big on a pioneer in this kind of thinking, that maybe it's some form of consciousness or extension of our consciousness that's interacting with us.
Yes.
So
there's always been that theory, that we are so connected. Well, see, I'd have to say that at the very end of the day, that yes, there is an absolute element of what you're mentioning here, because when you take out the separation, you take out the illusion of the physicality that we live in, you realize that there is this huge connection. So many times people have described this reality as interwoven, braided energy, certain areas much more intense perhaps in way of their manifestation than others. But if you were to understand this concept and look at this world in frequency and vibration, as Tesla had even mentioned, you get a whole different scope of how things are actually connected. So Charles, I believe that there may actually be a good solid bit of evidence in there somewhere we can follow up when it comes to that. But again, it's so hard because these concepts we speak on in way of proposals are intangible. And of course, we then lay back on a nice fluffy pillow of anecdotal experience. However comfortable, it does not afford a fantastic night's sleep, unfortunately. So
that's why history is so much more comfortable. So that's how I approach it. In terms of what I'm going to put out there, I love the history of it. The history is fantastic and fun and real. And, even looking at it as an historian, me writing that even the diehard skeptic might be left wondering, well, there are times when I'm a diehard skeptic and I read these cases and I'm left wondering. It's like, what the hell? This guy reported that he got pancakes from aliens, and the government analyzed those freaking pancakes, with our
Can you
tax dollars.
imagine?
Like our
Can
tax
you
dollars
imagine?
paid, for the investigation of Skinwalker Ranch with dino beavers and
Uh-huh.
and dire wolves. So,
You're,
it, it's the hit. Just the
well, I
history
mean, within
alone
that
is
evidence,
wacky and wonderful.
I think that there is proof that the interest of these subjects and topics go far beyond the public's fling into something hobby or peripheral, right? I think that there are certain organizations that want to know about this and perhaps know more than some of us do here within the common man land. And, we are seeking to create a connection between the two because of the disconnect. It's going to take some time if it happens at all the way that we would envision. Listen, Charles, we are coming to the end of our show, but I want to thank you very, very much for coming on and imparting your insight, your knowledge. You're very articulate. I really enjoy your passion for the history of ufology. And of course, you have other talents, let's say, in way of that research that you've expressed tonight. And I'd like to explore those with you at another point if you're willing to entertain it. But for the time being, could you, I do have links in the description, folks. You can go and check out Charles' new book and the work that he does otherwise. But in your own words, Charles, where can people find you and how can they support you?
I'm a regular blogger at podcastufo.com. Every week, Martin does a show on Tuesdays. It's also, I do an audio blog on Martin Willis's YouTube channel, and the books at Amazon.com. That's pretty much it.
Perfect. Well, everybody knows about Amazon. So, I mean, you can find it. It's out there. Go and pick it up, folks. It's a fantastic read. And I'm going to be doing the exact same thing as it's now been released as of yesterday. Once again, Charles, thank you so much for being with being with us here tonight. It was an absolute honor to hear your research and your opinions on these matters.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be on your show and speaking with you. So thank you, Michael.
Cheers. Cheers, mate.
Right.
Thank you so much, brother. I'm just going to take you off for the moment there. Thank you. All right, folks, that about sums it up for this evening. This is an ongoing topic that we will continue to address and dig deeper into. I'm going to be honest, when you do dig as far as you can within this topic, you do find little pebbles that add up to something more than what you might create for jewelry later on. I mean, there is something in way of construct in a much larger sense. And it's really, again, to reiterate, I have to. Where does disclosure come from? It comes from you. It comes from the individual in your conviction, through your experience, through your research. Don't wait for somebody to tell you that this is what it is. Come to your own decisions, do your own research, and you'll find the answers, at least to a certain extent, to the questions that we all have and that we continue to ask every single day. Very quickly, I want to thank my moderators for their fantastic work here today and every day on Dark Hour Paranormal. And of course, I want to thank Super Chatters for their donations and support. Denbub, thank you so much for yours. LIB, Mike Colantino, always supporting the channel. And Tina Mobley, thank you so much for your super chats, folks. Go ahead and check down in the description. You'll find jewelry and wares from Tina Mobley. She does a fantastic job. I have worn them on the show. Unfortunately, the cord that I have keeps breaking because I'm very active, and therefore they are now centerpieces within me, the studio that I have here. So I get to see them every day, and I think you should check them out too. Great epoxy work from Tina Mobley. Once again, guys, thank you so much for being here. We will be back next week. Won't say the names, but I do have quite a few things lined up. And of course, we're continuing to always shift and change over here in the best of ways at Dark Hour Paranormal. Until then, stay vigilant, stay explorative, and continue to research this field that we all find so nebulous, but yet still cannot sleep until we find those answers, or at least an inkling of something to follow within the trail of ufology and esoterics. We'll see you next time. Ciao.